A couple weeks ago, a friend of mine asked if we should read the Bible literally, and I was happy to get this question because I already want to talk about it here, but also because it's not a question that has a tidy yes or no answer. It really depends. So, just as a reminder, the Bible is not one book, it is a collection of many books and many different types of writing. It includes historical records, family trees, laws, poems, parables, biographies. It includes personal letters, sermons, and then even visions of the future. And so, how you read and understand each passage really depends on the kind of writing that it is. If you try to read a poem, for example, the same way that you read a biography, you are certainly going to misinterpret it. And then the same thing can happen when we read the Bible without adjusting our approach based on the type of writing that we're looking at. So, over the next couple of weeks, we are going to explore some of the best practices for reading all the different main styles of writing that we see in the Bible, and starting today with the letters. These are also known as the epistles, and they include New Testament books like Romans, 1st and 2nd Corinthians, Hebrews, 1st and 2nd Peter, and so on. So many of these letters were written by early Christian leaders who had direct experiences with Jesus. This included people like Peter, who was a disciple, James and Jude, who were brothers of Jesus, and Paul, who encountered the resurrected Jesus. And as the name letters suggests, these were letters, in fact, written to individuals or groups of people, and they were written in response to a specific situation or question. So while they do contain theology, their primary purpose wasn't to outline Christian beliefs in a systematic way. Instead, they were addressing real problems or real questions that first century Christians were facing. And a challenge that we have today is that when we read the letters, we're reading a response, but we don't always know the situation that prompted the response, whereas the original recipients would have been fully aware of both sides of the conversation. In their book, How to Read the Bible for All It's Worth, which I'm basing a lot of my series on, and so I'll link it in the description if you want to read it. The authors, Gordon Fee and Douglas Stewart, say, "We have the answers, but we do not always know what the questions or problems were, or even if there was a problem. It's much like hearing one end of a telephone conversation and trying to figure out who is on the other end and what that unseen party is saying." So to make sense of each letter, we need to answer two big questions. It's what did the letter mean to the original audience? And then what does the letter mean for us today? And we should always go in that order because you can't know what a letter means for us today until you first understand what it meant to the original audience. So we're now going to get into some best practices for answering these two big questions, starting with the first question. So the first best practice is to start with the historical context. Before reading a New Testament letter, it can be really helpful to know who wrote it, who they were writing to, when they wrote the letter, and just what was happening at that time in the church, in the city, in the culture. So an example is that in 1 Corinthians, Paul is writing to a wealthy church in an influential port city of Corinth, and that at that time, around AD 55, the early church was expanding. The Corinthian believers were navigating a life in culture that's obsessed with status and morally flexible. And you can compare that to 1 Timothy, which was also written by Paul, but this time it was written to just one person, Timothy, who was a young church leader in Ephesus. And Ephesus was, a major city as well, but is known for its temple to Artemis and spiritual activity. And Timothy was leading a church there during a time of growing false teachings and Christian opposition. So to find out this kind of background information, you can read the book Intros if you have a study Bible, or you can look it up in a Bible dictionary or commentary, or just try searching for it online. The next best practice is to read the whole letter from start to finish, just like you would read any other letter today, and ideally read it more than once in multiple translations so that you don't miss anything good. This helps you understand the information in its proper context, because out of context, it's really easy to misunderstand the meaning. For example, in Philippians chapter 4, verse 13, it says, "I can do all things through him who gives me strength." And you see people using this out of context all the time, applying it to their ability to achieve their personal goals. But in context, it's clear that Paul's not talking about that. He's talking about Christians' ability to endure suffering and hardship with contentment. So pretty different. Okay, so best practice number 3 is that as you're reading the whole letter, try to outline the basic facts, either in your head or you can even write stuff down on paper, but answer these questions. What problem is the writer addressing? What questions might the recipients have asked that prompted it? What tone is the author using? Were they instructions, corrections, or encouragements? Keep showing up. What's the main reason that they wrote the letter? Are there natural sections or shifts in the letter? And you can also pay attention to things like paragraph breaks and transitions, language like therefore, and topic changes, because this can help you match the different parts of the letter to specific problems or needs it's addressing. So everything we've covered so far really relates to that first question, what did the letter mean to the original audience? And we're now transitioning into the second question, what does the letter mean for us today? And this is where it can get tricky and risky because it's challenging to distinguish, between what was intended specifically for the first century audience and what applies to us today and to what degree it applies to us. And often when we read these letters, we're doing it through our own cultural lens, or often we're always doing that. And so we're making theological assumptions and we risk being inconsistent in treating the things that feel familiar to us as timeless truths and the things that feel unfamiliar to us as irrelevant to the past. So a next best practice we can do to read the Bible more consistently is to distinguish between primary and secondary teachings. Our goal is to avoid becoming modern day Pharisees who turn the gospel into, another set of rules by treating cultural applications of secondary issues as if they were primary. So keep the primary things primary and keep the secondary things secondary. Primary teachings include things like our struggle with sin and then the redemption God offers us through Christ, whereas secondary teachings are more like, differences in ministry styles, spiritual gifts, and clothing. And in saying this, it doesn't mean that we don't care about secondary things, just that we understand their place. Okay, so another best practice is to distinguish between moral principles and cultural applications. Moral principles are things that apply to everyone in every culture, whereas cultural applications are just simply culturally appropriate ways to live out those moral principles. For example, in 1 Timothy, Paul says that one of the requirements for widows who were receiving financial assistance from the church is washing the feet of the saints. Here, the timeless principles are humility and service, not foot washing. Foot washing was just a culturally appropriate way of applying the principles of humility and service in that first century context. So if you're like, well, that sounds good, I'd like to differentiate, but how do I know something's a moral principle versus a cultural application? Unfortunately, we don't always know, but the Bible does usually give us clues. And one clue is whether a teaching stays consistent throughout all of Scripture or whether it changes. So if a teaching stays consistent, it likely reflects a lasting moral principle, but if the teaching shifts, it could be a sign that it is related to culture. An example of this could be sexuality. The Bible is pretty consistent in its teaching of sexuality throughout the different books and the different authors. Whereas if you compare this to women in ministry, in some passages the Bible seems to be really discouraging, while in others it is praised and assumed, even within different letters by the same author. Another clue we have is first century cultural norms. It can be really helpful to know what options were available to the writers. So when a writer goes along with the culture, it might be because there weren't other options at the time. And when they go against culture, it can signal that there could be something deeper and timeless that we might want to pay attention to. So using the same examples, in the first century, women generally were considered less important than men. They were generally not educated, and they were far less likely to work outside of the home, especially in public or leadership roles. So when the New Testament writers address women's roles in the letters, it is possible that they're teaching a timeless principle, but it's also possible that they're just reflecting the cultural norms of the time. Whereas, or other example, the teaching on same-sex relationships, that was a challenge to the cultural norm, and so it suggests that maybe the writers were offering a distinct moral principle. And it's not just women's roles or sexuality. We can apply these same standards to other topics addressed in the letters, all of them. Slavery, spiritual gifts, baptism, communion, how to observe the Sabbath, divorce and remarriage, alcohol use, clothing, food, and everything else. So bringing it all together with my last best practice for today, it is to remember to be kind and respectful when you disagree. We're in a position where we don't know both sides of the conversation, and we're bringing our limited understanding, our cultural lens, our theological, personal biases into interpretation. And even Christian scholars don't always agree about the correct way to interpret every teaching. So it is just good and wise to have some humility with our own interpretations and exercise patience and respect and love for each other, even when we disagree. The first century church in Ephesus had people from all kinds of backgrounds. They had both Jews and Gentiles. They had men and women. They had people who were free and people who had been slaves. And it's safe to assume that they didn't agree on everything. But in Paul's letter to them, he writes, "Be completely humble and gentle. Be patient, bearing with one another in love. Make every effort to keep the unity of the Spirit through the bond of peace." And then Jesus himself says, "A new command I give you, love one another as I have loved you, so you must love one another. By this, everyone will know that you are my disciples, if you love one another." That is a clear moral principle that can guide us in our different interpretations. So I have a question for you. I am curious if you have ever read something in the Bible that confused you, or maybe you felt one way about, and then when you learned more about the context, that changed your thinking. Or is there maybe a book or a passage that you'd like to revisit now with a fresh lens? If you have questions about this or about another topic related to Christianity, please post them in the comments and I will try to answer there or in a future video. And if you want to follow along with this little series we're doing or see other content like this, you can subscribe by hitting the button below this video, and then I'll see you soon. I'm doing my best to post every week, but work has been very busy lately, so they might be spaced out a tiny bit more in the next couple weeks, but I hope to get back into that weekly rhythm. But anyway, thank you again so much for being here. See you later.